60s, 70s, hailed as a great boon, end of poverty, increased yields, etc., etc. And for quite some time it worked out. But it was a very short-term thing, because the Green Revolution was based on hybrid seeds, which already were non-regenerative, I guess is what you would call it. They were sterile. And it required a lot of pesticides and a lot of chemical fertilizers. It depleted the nutrients in the earth, and the farmers found themselves already in a vicious cycle where they're spending every year more and more and getting lower yields. So when people talk about conventional cotton seeds in India, they're really talking about something that goes back 50 years, not just 15 years or 10 years. There are a few villages where farmers grow organic cotton, and I would like to see more of that. And there are a number of organizations that are helping the farmers with that. For example, Navdanya, which is Vandana Shiva's organization, Oxfam is active. I'm connected with a small NGO in India called Organic India. And actually what we're going to do, and I'm very happy to be able to talk about that because it's only recently, in the last week, came together after a year of working on it, is we're going to do a village tour with a film in partnership with the local farming organization. And not only show the film to the farmers, and starting with Telang Takli, the village where it was filmed, but then have a conversation between the local organizers and the farmers of each village about what are their options. And things like organic seeds will be brought up. How to get into the organic market of cotton, which is very important because the only way that that would really help them is if they were able to get better prices for their cotton. The price of the cotton is artificially low. If you remember from the film, we, American taxpayers, are giving $4 billion a year to American cotton growers, subsidizing them. Whether you like it or not, it's part of the Farm Bill. And as a result of that, American cotton growers are able to sell their cotton on world markets for less than what it's costing them to grow it, which is keeping the world prices of cotton low. And by the way, all of us are benefiting from it because the clothes that we buy are cheaper. But that's part of what makes it so difficult for farmers like Ram Krishna to survive in India. I hope that the organic seeds will become a much more of a mainstay of the cotton industry there. In this part of India, Vidarbha, there are 23,000 villages. There are 3 million farmers who grow cotton. It's a huge crop in India. And when you walk into the stores over there, you would think that there will be, a range of products on the shelves. You have a range of brands in a seed shop, but they're all genetically modified and they all have this Bollgard logo of Monsanto. There's no other option right now for the farmers. So I hope that this will begin to happen. Now, 2 more things I want to tell you. One is, when I made the film, I was very concerned that I'm going to leave you at the end feeling hopeless. And so I actually invited a local NGO called the Vidarbha Organic Farmer Association to donate organic seeds to this village that you see in the film, which is called Telang Takli. Now why, and I filmed the scene of them coming and donating the seeds. The girl Manjusha was there with a camera asking some good questions. Now why is that scene not in the film? It's actually in the DVDs in the bonus scenes, but the reason it's not in the film is because I realized that at this level it was not a practical option. First of all, they didn't have enough organic seeds for the whole village. And this is the organization of organic farmers, and they could not bring enough organic seeds. Second, when they explained to the farmers that in order to switch to organic, you have to leave the land fallow for 3 years so that the chemicals will leach out of it, you could see the faces of the farmers falling because it's just not an option for them. So to go into organic, you need more than just giving them organic seeds. You need to have a support program through the transition period. You need to train them very clearly. If you remember in the film, the old farmer, Keshav, he mentions cow dung, what used to be the fertilizer. They need to be trained again in how to use leaves, compost, dung to create fertilizer. Some of this old knowledge is no longer around. And the last thing I want to leave you with, and this is a bit of good news, and I'm not sure exactly the meaning of it yet, but very recently, after a lot of pressure, the state government of Maharashtra, which is where this village is located, has banned Monsanto's cotton seeds. This is just a few weeks ago. Yeah, it is very exciting. I'm not sure yet. In India, nothing is straightforward. And so I'm not sure yet how binding it is, how likely it is to be reversed. What does that mean in terms of what the farmers will have next year? But it's a start. Well, first of all, regarding the revolving door, it's even broader than just the FDA. The many parts of the U.S. government, whether it's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, whether it is USAID, the head of USAID is a former scientist working in a scientific center in St. Louis, just connected to Monsanto, funded by Monsanto. He's now the head of USAID. Now, USAID, are you guys familiar with USAID? Every sack of seeds or help that our government, humanitarian aid that we give around the world, has on it a logo that says, "From the American people." When I started researching that, I thought that I would put a short segment about that in the film, and I realized it was so vast that it requires a film of its own. But the USAID, through a lot of different indirect and direct ways, is promoting genetic modification in agriculture all over the world. By indirect, I mean, for example, a university in the United States will invite journalists from a country in Africa where GM is not allowed to come to a seminar where they will learn that GM is a more efficient form of farming and they should go back home and write opinion pieces in the local papers to request their government to change their laws. That's kind of the indirect ways. So the head of USAID is also a former Monsanto employee. And it goes on and on and on like that. Now, Ignacio mentions the Supreme Court. Well, the most important legal decision ever taken in connection to genetic modification was the decision to allow patenting life forms. Why is it so important? Because once you can put a patent on it, it enables Monsanto and other corporations to invest millions of dollars in developing these seeds, and they know that nobody can steal it from them. Now, that decision was written, the majority opinion was written by our friend Clarence Thomas. Now, why are we mentioning him here? Because he, earlier in his career, was an attorney for Monsanto. And you'd think that he would have recused himself, but oh no. Now, maybe one last example of that, also I found out in the research for this film, is that parts of our foreign policy, I thought it's all crafted by the State Department and administration, is actually given into the hands of major US corporations. So in 2005, the US and India signed a major technology sharing agreement. Monsanto, as well as Walmart and other corporations, were invited to sit on the advisory board that drafted the actual language of this agreement. And what Monsanto's interest was to speed up the approval track for their genetically modified seeds in India. So now they already have 8 different crops that they're selling GM in India. Last year, by the way, the Indian government announced that they were about to approve the 9th one, which was brinjal. Anybody knows what brinjal is? Eggplant. Exactly, eggplant. Huge public outcry. The Indian government held public hearings in 11 cities throughout India. And in Bangalore, an 83-year-old man got in front of the microphone and he said, I am the former director of Monsanto in India, and in the 1990s, my bosses in the States instructed me to provide the Indian government with false documents to speed up the approval process. They provided the Indians with studies that were done in the United States as if those took place in India. So these are the kind of things that they're doing. Now, there was a question about the collaboration between Monsanto and the Indian government and why it's not in the film. There were a lot of things I had to leave out of the film. The film is already 90 minutes. My approach to filmmaking is I believe that a film should, first of all, be a story. I'm a storyteller. Human beings learn through stories. But if the film intrigued you and tickled your curiosity, then please go online and look up things, and you can find out all the rest of the information is there. So, there were many important things that I couldn't put in the film, but, they're easy to find.
I want to say something about meeting you, Michal, some years ago, and being really intrigued. Michal is a very, very interesting and intriguing character. And one of the biggest mysteries about you that came to my mind was how does he get access to people in this incredible manner? If you get to see the other movies, you will see that what you see in this movie about people really talking so incredibly openly to the camera is really unusual. I don't know what you think, but I find it really unusual in documentary making. And getting to know you more and more over the years, I think I'm beginning to understand, and this really beautiful capacity you have to simply let things reveal themselves. The stories, be open to whatever the story is and let it reveal itself. So I think this movie, as well as you, have this capacity to go to very deep, intimate details of things, make them really real and local, and yet, and this is I think what the genius is, yet it connects really widely to all these international questions without having to even talk about them and just rub them on your face. You really manage to pull out the connections that we are discussing here. And I think it's really good to understand that way of narrating who we are, what we're doing for this kind of campaign. Because you're talking about something very local here, and yet it is something that really connects and really has enormous consequences for farmers in India as well as in Brazil and Bolivia and everywhere in the world, in Indonesia and so on. The whole drive, for example, for biofuels right now. And what's happening with the so-called soy republic, the whole Amazon basin, all that is being impacted by what's happening here. So I think the responsibility of being here is incredibly important, and taking it seriously and with that naturalness that you have would be essential, because the project of genetic engineering is not a technical project of a few people here and there. It's not even a Monsanto project. It is a project of the nation of the U.S. It's a state project. That's why State Department runs the project. It's not the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Economy. It is State Department. It is run as a project of national priority in the biosafety priorities that the Bush administration put out soon after 9/11. The promotion of biotechnology around the world was number 2. Right after go and get Al-Qaeda or whatever it was, the second point was our national interest is to promote biotechnology in the world, because that is going to be the economic advantage of the US into the future, and so on and so forth. This is an idea that I'm willing to believe was reasonable at some point. Back in the 80s, when these things really were not tested, we are in the land of frontiers, right? We really love the idea of frontier breaking, of risk taking, and we take risk as a business opportunity. That's what we do in this country. It makes sense. I don't like it personally, but I think I can understand that somebody would push like that. It was back then in the Bush and Quayle administration that this was embedded as a national interest project. And they decided that we should look the other way. We should remove all regulations. We should never label. We should never let people see, because we wanted this industry to move forward in the same way that the computer industry had moved forward, the space travel and satellite technology had moved forward, the material sciences, information technology, and so on. It was exactly the same ideal that we wanted to have this economic advantage in the world. All fine and good, perhaps, except it didn't work. We have been with genetic engineering for 40 years already. We are actually marking this year the 40th anniversary of the first transgenic manipulation here at Stanford. And yet, we really haven't done anything with it, anything useful, anything that people could really rally around and say, okay, I'm willing to suffer the problems with the electronics industry, for example, that has lots of serious problems, environmental problems. The disposal of e-waste, for example, is just horrendous, and you have seen those documentaries too. And yet, there are many people who are willing to go and put a lot of money and camp outside of the Apple store and so on for electronics. Biotechnology is not like that. The whole dream of biotechnology of the 70s never came true, and we find ourselves now 40 years down the line. It is an old and tired promise being told, look the other way, close your eyes, leave it to the experts, give us more time, give us more money, and pigs will fly. And so I find it really important and really interesting that you organized this today, because the connections here, the way this story really connects things, is, I think, a really useful way of thinking of ourselves acting here locally, and how this tiny little, it looks tiny, I'm sure it doesn't look tiny to you, but this modest proposition can actually have an incredibly important impact in the world in stopping something that is a bad story, almost like a nightmare that we cannot wake up from.
And, I still remember that once there used to be the slogan, what's good for GM is good for America. At that time, they were talking about General Motors. Now you could say maybe it's another kind of GM. But as far as how our government keeps promoting it, you would think that this is actually being declared as a U.S. national interest. It reminds me one more thing. Before there was a question about the revolving door and all of that. You can find on YouTube a clip of George Bush Sr. when he was running for elections. He is visiting the Monsanto headquarters, the greenhouse in there. You saw this, huh? In St. Louis. And they're showing him around, and they're complaining to him that it takes so long for the government process to approve their new seeds. And he said, if you have any problems, just give me a call. That's on YouTube. You can find that. Ignacio, I wanted to ask you maybe a question here. Maybe for some people it's clear, but I don't think it's clear for everybody. We are bombarded with propaganda that says GM is the efficient way for farming. Bill Gates, his foundation, I see full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal or New Yorker magazine promoting that. And many people actually wonder, from the point of view of the farming, not from the point of view of the consumer eating it, but from farming, why isn't it a good way to go? They're saying there's going to be 9 billion people on the planet in the year 2050. So why isn't GM agriculture a good way to go?
Is that a good question to deal with? Is that a good question to deal with? Yeah. I think it is a good question to deal with. Thank you. There are so many ways to address this that make sense. I think it's important to recognize the foundation of this technology. I made the mistake of calling it a technology. It is not even a technology. It's so easy to call it a technology, but it's not. Think of what a technology is. The technology of putting metal and rubber together to produce a bicycle, based off of a blueprint that you can actually design. You say, okay, this is what the parts are, and this is what the function is going to be. And then you have that blueprint, you have your raw materials, you put them in your process, and out comes the bicycle technology. It's something that you can predict, it's something that you can design, it's something that you can do over and over and over in a reproducible and controllable way. No such thing exists in genetic engineering. What we do is a trial and error, experimenting, piggybacking on millions and millions and millions of trials and millions of errors before you get one of these so-called events. You've heard that the individual product of Monsanto is called event, MON 810, NK693, whatever the one that's being discussed right now. It's the one time after millions of trials that they got something to stick and something to survive and something to begin looking something like a plant. And then through enormous effort, cajoling this callus tissue to develop into a plant and so on. So we could be talking about how the so-called technology isn't even a technology itself, and it doesn't work because it's founded on failed foundations. It's founded on something called the central dogma, which for a scientist to be talking about dogmas is right from the beginning a red alarm. But it is taught to our high school students that this is the way things are put together by pieces and parts that can be mixed and matched. These so-called genes that you can pull from one place and put into the other and so on. And yet it doesn't work like that, which is the reason why we still have two main things out there in the world: herbicide-resistant plants and the insecticide-producing plants. And you have them in 5 different flavors, corn, soybean, canola, and so on. And that makes 99% of the acreage of genetically engineered plants. It's not because they're so great, it's because we cannot do better with the foundations of this manipulation, genetic engineering. Let's imagine that even by chance, we happen upon these two so-called products. To call a living thing a product really rubs me the wrong way. But let's suppose that that's okay. Okay, which other way can we look at agriculture and find out whether it makes sense or not, whether it is a good thing to do or not? Well, I think I would ask, have we really done the things that we were looking for back in the 70s and 80s, things that we promised? Did we increase yield? The answer is no. If you look at the actual numbers of whether these things actually increase yield, the generous thing to say is that they break even. But there's a lot of drag in the genetically engineered varieties that tends to bring yield lower than normal. So there is no real increase in yield. We were promised that we would also have a drop in chemical use. And even though that might have been real for the first couple of years of acreage after the commercial releases in '96, the application of herbicides has been going through the roof, especially after the emergence of the super weeds. These are weeds that have become predictably resistant to the herbicide, so you cannot get rid of them anymore. So now we have been already for a long time mixing in old herbicides that we supposedly had grown out of because they were so toxic. So now, for example, Roundup gets mixed in with 2,4-D, with dicamba, with all the horrible past things that we thought we had left behind. So we're going backwards in terms of chemical use. We're applying much more. In terms of insecticide use, the use of insecticides has increased too. So if you look at the actual numbers, there is no benefit that you can talk about. If you look at the financial markets, which would be another way of slicing it, where you say, okay, but maybe they're making money in some way by accessing the commodities markets and so on. If you pull the subsidies away, this thing would have disappeared a long time ago, because the financial people have understood that there is no money to be made. By 1999, the Deutsche Bank was putting out a report to investors saying, move your money away from this because this ain't working. So since the 2000 burst of that balloon, of that bubble, which was completely underreported by the media, but it's real, you can go and see the reports from the Deutsche Bank, for example, and then look at the movement of money away from that agricultural biotechnology in 2000. From that moment on, there is absolutely no reason, apart from favoring the concentration of profit in a few hands, and apart from furthering, which I think you mentioned very well at the beginning, connecting it with that idea of green revolution, which is the idea that we can remove people, we can remove complexity, we can remove knowledge and ways of relating to other organisms from agriculture, so that we can have an agriculture that looks like a factory, an agriculture that can be run by one person on a big machine over large acreages, which we know is a huge disaster. It's a major disaster in all kinds of ways, and it's a disaster that is waiting to show its ugliest head when we have, for example, right now we have the emergence of a very important rust disease of wheat that is coming out of Africa, has moved already through Yemen, and is moving out into the Middle East, and nobody knows how it's going to stop. But the wheat people, who is wheat people? We are all wheat people. Anybody who eats wheat should be very worried about the spread of this rust that is wiping out these monocultures of completely homogeneous plants. Whether they're genetically engineered or not is not the question. It's this bet on an agriculture without people. It's the idea that we can live in isolation and in complete separation from our food source and our ways of growing things. And I have to say, what you're doing here is important in that respect, because here in this country, we have gone as far as forgetting that, or not even realizing that you and I and all of us are landless, seedless peasants. We're not even peasants. We don't even have the hope of reaching back to knowledge, or reaching back to seed, or reaching back to ways of producing our food that would be sustainable, let alone survivable. And we have been sold this idea that we must be separated from our livelihood, from the life that supports us. How tragic is that? And I believe that what you're doing is opening our eyes to that reality and turning us around to say, wait, we need to stop and we need to recover that capacity. Recover not only the seeds, but the knowledge, the access to the soil, the access to knowledge about how to deal with soil, with water, with biological diversity, and so on. So it's great. It's a fantastic time to be alive with people like you, and to know that we're heading in a much more interesting direction than what I have lived through so far. Really happy to be alive today. Thank you. I think it's been touched on already. This is a State Department project, which means all the embassies around the world for quite a couple of decades have already, they have central instructions on what to do, what are the campaigns that need to be pushed. They have personnel that are local language speakers, and one of the things they have been doing already, as I said, for a couple of decades, is to go to the legislatures, to go to Congress, Parliament, whatever it is, the government representatives, and present them with an already written legislation. It usually is called a biosafety legislation. In Mexico, it keeps being pushed and being resisted back mostly by public pressure, but it's called the Monsanto law, because it's so blatantly a law dedicated to open up everything It's not only the commercial channels, but also the access to land, the access to labor, the access to water, and so on, all in favor of Monsanto. And you say Mexico because that's a country that I know better. I come from there. It's a very important place. We have absolutely no regard for the fact that Mexico, in this case, is the center of origin and the place where the diversity of seeds of many of the crops that the world needs exist, and we're putting them at risk just for the benefit of Monsanto and a couple of other companies like DuPont, Pioneer, and so on. But this idea that through the action of State Department, the embassies in different countries, and a very well-coordinated effort around the world, that new legislation is being put in place that simply homogenizes the access to the world is something that I find particularly scary and worrisome.
So, thank you. I have a question for you. A lot of questions here are asking what has been done for holding Monsanto accountable in India, and then also are these farmers getting reimbursed? Are they getting money? Are they getting any type of benefit from the government due to their losses and the suicides and things like that?
So I've already mentioned before about the recent legislation in Maharashtra banning Monsanto seeds. Regarding getting any reimbursement from the government, there have been a lot of pressures, which I think are misguided, on the Indian government to come to the help of the farmers by creating a debt relief package, which would mean that Ramakrishna, that you just saw in the film, could next year go back to the bank and borrow money all over again. So yes, it will help him in the short run because it's lower interest rate than from a loan shark. But all it does is maintaining the channel of cash going to Monsanto or any other of these kind of companies. What they need is a structural change. Until the early 1990s, India had a lot of government involvement in agriculture. There still is the National Cotton Research Institute, which used to produce every year new varieties and give them to the farmers. That's gone. They used to have agronomists, government employees that would travel from village to village and give the farmers advice. That's gone. You saw in the film, the only advice they get are from the salesmen of the seeds, who give them, fraudulent pamphlets and everything they say is basically one lie on top of the other. They do have in India a program that is supposed to give financial support for widows of farmers that committed suicide to the tune of 1 million rupees, which for a farming family in India is a lot of money. But even that, the way that law is written is in such a way that most widows don't qualify. For example, it says that in order to qualify, the farmer that committed suicide must have had land registered on his name. Now that sounds to us very reasonable, but the fact is that in India, like Ramakrishna, for example, he never went to register the name on his land, on his name. Why? There's no need to. In a village, everybody knows. Everybody knows who his father was and knows that, from that tree to that ravine over there, that's Ramakrishna's land. Nobody will ever contest it. And to register is not that easy. He would have to travel to the district capital, spend a whole day there, stand in line, then be told that he doesn't have the right documents. It'll cost him money to produce these documents. He'll come back and then they will demand a bribe from him because nothing gets done with the authorities without a little bit of greasing of the palms. And, he can't afford all of that. Just the bus ride fare over there would be a major burden on him. So people like him often don't register their land in their name, and the widows will not even touch that money. I would like to see the Indian government creating a completely different kind of program, looking for a sustainable future in farming. India has the largest farming community in the world. India also has a terrible problem in all the major cities because farmers who lose their land are moving to the cities, which cannot support them. There isn't an infrastructure, whether it is housing, schools, sewage, anything. And yet every day, tens of thousands more people are moving to the cities because they're losing their livelihood in the countryside. So as a country, they certainly have an interest in helping farmers get into a sustainable kind of a business model where they could continue to provide for their families, and their children and grandchildren would continue to be able to do that. And that's part of what I see as an international global issue here is, what's going to be the future of half of mankind who are farmers? Anyway, this is a vast issue that we can talk about for a long time. Maybe you want to add something to that.
If anybody has any other questions, just raise your little card, and then maybe Kate, if you can walk around and grab it. But some of these other questions were asking why you haven't heard about Monsanto or the other chemical companies and what you can do to help. And I just, Proposition 37 is something that you can do right here in your area. When I first saw this film, Frank, one of our other coordinators, is like, you have to watch it, it's great. And I started watching it, and I had to walk out a few times because I was so pissed off, and I was crying, and I was like, this is ridiculous that something like this is going on. And I was just livid at the situation of what we're going through. We're not even going through it at hand. People in India are, and how hardly anybody is aware of it. And this, what we're doing right now, this proposition and the California Right to Know campaign really lets us take action in something that we all believe in. We can get out there on the streets and we can talk to people and we can tell them what's going on. And it's not only about California and labeling, it's like a stance that we're making for the entire world. So yeah, we're labeling in California, but it's sparking this awareness that is only gonna grow. We're just gonna continue to get more and more people involved and aware of the situation and expose Monsanto and these other chemical companies that aren't exposed. And it just frustrates me to no end. So that's something you can really do, and we really need your help. We have 5 weeks left this past Tuesday to win November 6th, and our opposition has already raised, or not even raised, they've put in, we need to raise the money, they have it. They've put in $37 million, and we have about 3, but they don't have us. They don't have the people on the ground. They have commercials blasting the airwaves. I was at my house the other night, my aunt's in town, and she calls me out every 20 minutes. Rachel, come here, and it's a no on Prop 37 ad. And I'm just like, what the hell is this? And we don't have any money to have commercials. So it's kind of frustrating, but we have thousands and thousands of you guys all over the ground working and putting out tables and talking to people and just getting to people's ears before they see those commercials and they hear those commercials. So I really, really encourage you to get involved with the campaign and know to vote yes, but also to talk to people, make a pledge to wear a button every single day until November 6th. Do one little thing that you can do to spread awareness to at least one other person per day.
We have a number of different organizations sponsoring different nights. The Label GMOs campaign is sponsoring opening night tomorrow, which starts with a reception at 6 p.m. And we have organizations such as Food First, Food and Water Watch, each one sponsoring another night. Bay Area Video Coalition is taking on another night. So, we're trying to get a lot of organizations around it. I've donated 45 screenings, public screenings, this is one of them, in the state of California for this campaign, and thank you. And one thing that you can do, I've been able to do that through some fundraising, and funders like to see social networks numbers. So if you would please go to Facebook page for Bitter Seeds Film and just like us, that would help us. I'm sure there are many other ways that you can get involved. Navtanya, the organization of Vandana Shiva that's in the film, Can always use more support, so please go online and check it out. You know, I have to tell you, I've been with this film really all over the world, from Brazil to South Africa, from Israel to, I was just in Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia last week, and yesterday I returned from Vancouver, Canada, and everywhere people are really connecting with the film because it somehow reflects of them the situation in their own country. You know, there isn't a country in the world that doesn't have farmers. You know, here we're kind of unique in a sense in the West that so few of us are farmers, less than 2% of the population. But when I was in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan last week, I asked people in the audience, raise your hand if somebody in your family is a farmer. And this was in Bishkek, is the capital of the country. Practically everybody in the audience raised their hand. They all have farmers in their family. So people everywhere are connected with this. So please help to spread the word.
So we have time for just this one last question. There's two. Sorry, we're going to skip one. You can ask them later if you want. When a country like the U.S., which is perceived to be such a strong democracy, is having issues and difficulties dealing with its government, how can a country like India follow this and rid it with corruption, deal with Monsanto? How can we stop this colonization of capitalism?
What's the other question?
The other one is, what programs exist in India to produce open pollinating seed without government support? Is there an internal market for cotton in India? So you can choose.
There always comes a moment when I say, I'm just a dumb filmmaker. You know, I'm not an expert in this. I make a film, I spend a few years in it, I get very involved, and then I move on to another topic. It reminds me that some time ago, I actually debated after a screening on a stage a scientist who, according to Wikipedia, is considered one of the inventors of genetic modification in agriculture. He's a Belgian guy. I thought that I would be that's what I would be saying the entire time, because, you know, I certainly cannot debate the science with a scientist. But by the way, the gist of that debate was, he said, beautiful moving film, but you lay the blame at the wrong door. The problem is governance. The government of India is corrupt and ineffective, and that's the problem. And my response was, dear professor, yes, the government of India is corrupt and ineffective, but they've always been that way, since India was founded in 1947. But the farmers have always been able to make a living growing cotton until genetically modified seeds arrived. That's the only thing that changed recently. So it's not rocket science. Regarding influencing things in India, you know, I really don't know more about it than anybody else. To me, India is a very chaotic place. Nothing seems possible there, and yet the impossible gets completed every day. It's a pretty amazing place. And people with vision and determination are doing amazing things. There's a guy there called Krishan Gupta who has convinced farmers to switch hundreds of thousands of acres of tea plantations into organic tea that is now being also imported to this country. So some people are doing amazing things in India. But in terms of the government, you know, I don't have a whole lot of faith that that's where reform will start.
I'm going to make a pointy-headed comment because I feel it's called for. The reference to the U.S. as the point of reference, as the gold standard for a system that works. How could other systems be brought to work? I think that reflects some problem there, because I think what we're talking about, and we were just discussing that in the previous meeting where I was talking about synthetic biology and what's happening in Berkeley and throughout the Bay Area with the promotion of this crazy idea of synthetic biology. is that we're talking about two kinds of engineering. We're talking about the engineering or the attempts at engineering life, but also the very successful engineering of institutions, the genetic engineering of institutions. And I think that the project of genetically engineering, and by genetically I mean inherited capacity to reproduce a system that moves over time, the genetic engineering of US institutions has gone so far at this point that I would not really hold it as a golden standard for the world. In fact, I would say, how could this possibly ever work? We see that in India, with all its corruption and everything, things happen. We see that in Mexico, the Monsanto law gets resisted and repealed over and over and over and over. This doesn't happen in this country because your Supreme Court, your Congress, your legislature in Sacramento, your universities are turned inside out, engineered from the inside to continue reproducing this model of thinking and this way of approaching the world. So I think we have our job cut out for ourselves here to really go back and rethink whether we want to have that kind of genetically engineered institution and society that does not allow the movement of other ideas into a world. And again, I just have to say what you guys are doing here with Prop 37 is an incredibly important, it doesn't look like it, but it's an incredibly important step in that direction, which is the direction of, first of all, opening your eyes, and then taking action on what you see.